My grandfather lives in the backwoods of Atlantic Canada. Built his own house, acres of untouched land, hardly any neighbors for miles, the whole deal. I remember a few occasions where things were a little off, from when I stayed with him rather frequently as a young child. My grandfather was a bear of a man, very tall and very secretive of his own life, even from my grandmother, who had separated from him years prior. He lived alone on a dirt street that cut through woods that he owned. His only neighbor, if it is close enough to consider that, was his nephew Kenneth. Once, when we were staying at a hunting camp separate from his home, he described to me what he called sounds to look out for. One was the sound white birch trees make when their limbs rub against one another, like a screaming sound, when there is no such trees in the area. Another was the sound of breaking ice during any time but winter, or not near water. He gave no explanation for these warnings. I remember a summer where all of his barn cats, about 16 healthy felines, were discovered torn up in the forest of his property. That same summer I walked outside to find what appeared to be several dozen green moth wings scattered below a maple tree in his yard. No bodies, just the wings. Soon after that he butchered a young pig and put its head in the same tree and left the body somewhere in the forest. I remember it draped across the back of his ATV. He locked me inside the house. Two stranger things occur to me that make me relate this to skinwalkers. I will continue. In the first situation we were taking a walk into the forest and he was teaching me about plants, tea berries and spruce gum. We came across a wet, almost boggy part of his property, nearing a marsh that I was told to never explore as he had lost a sister there when he was young. He paused, just stopped walking before looking up and around, as if scanning the tree line. I remember looking down and at our feet, rather clearly, were several sets of bare human footprints in the freshly dust-streaked earth. We left soon after. I remember sleeping in the living room that night so he could keep an eye on me. He did not rest. Another instance where I remember being rather frightened during a late summer night. There were never any visitors of note at my grandfather's house, maybe a handful of times a few of his old friends stopped in, but never stayed late or long. On this instance, there was a knock on the door extremely late at night. It woke me up. I remember my grandfather coming into the spare room and closing his hand around my mouth, almost wrapping around me. There was a pause and then another knock. By this time I was fully awake and frightened. My grandfather kept his attention trained on the two windows in the bedroom, each on the corner of the house. There was a long pause before a voice called out to him, using his first name. It stopped for a moment before repeating, sounding like it moved from the front and opposite side of the one-story house. I remember being confused as I didn't recognize the voice. My grandmother and every adult that I had ever heard refer to my grandfather had referred to him as my pet name for him, or Phil. At this time the voice called out, "Philip." We stayed, uncomfortably bent over the side of the bed as the voice moved around the house, stopping and calling his name with decreasing urgency each time before stopping at one of the windows of the spare room I slept in. I remember seeing a shadow slip up against the darkened glass, likely cast by the property light. My grandfather then covered my entire face with his hand. The voice spoke his name again, lowering to a whisper. It stayed there, as if trying to rouse him from sleep, although his room was a window over, and he never slept in the spare. It paused, then asked if he was in there, flatly as if it already well knew he was awake. It then spoke up, "It's Kenneth." It said that it had some trouble with its car, just down the road a bit. It couldn't get home. It was getting cold. I recall its voice taking on a whining tone before stopping. It said, finally, that it would come back tomorrow. My grandfather kept me close that night, not sleeping. I left the following day, early in the morning. I barely visited my grandfather after that. Instead I was pushed off on my grandmother. Staying with her in town as there was more to do. After that and even now, my grandfather makes a point to visit me when he can, less and less as he grows unable to travel. On the occasions I do see him he always returns to his out-of-the-way property before nightfall, to look after the land. He always says, in an almost boyish voice, that he'd better get on home, before it gets too dark. I worry about who will have to look after the land after he goes. I'm the only grandchild he has.